Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Morrison. The whisper you hear in the dark is not the wind. It is the language the past has chosen to speak with you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so you don't get lost in the darkness. Now, the story begins. Get ready. The Crimson Toll of Shadow Ridge. My name is William, and I am an exhausted accountant from Seattle who decided to spend a week at a remote, private cabin near the peaks of Shadow Ridge, Colorado. For years, I dismissed the local warnings about the watchers in the woods as simple, rural attempts to keep outsiders away from their pristine wilderness. I was profoundly wrong. I have recently discovered that this mountain retreat is not a peaceful getaway, but a structural harvest field for jinns, primordial and formless entities that have claimed this altitude as their personal hunting ground. They do not hunt through physical force, as they have no need to touch anyone. They simply project their will upon a target, and the human life essence is instantly extracted, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, desiccated husk. Last Wednesday, while hiking near a high-elevation clearing, I witnessed their harvesting process. Two hikers, who had set up camp in a picturesque meadow nearby, froze suddenly in the middle of their preparations. I watched them through my binoculars from a concealed rock ledge, and my breath hitched when the air around them became unnaturally heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and metallic decay. Without any physical interaction, without a single hand reaching toward them, their bodies petrified simultaneously. Their expression shifted from the leisure of a summer vacation to a state of total, abyssal abandonment. In a single synchronized heartbeat, a stream of dark, deep blood, under immense pressure, erupted from their eyes, ears, and mouths. It was an ejection of brutal efficiency, instantly staining the wildflowers and alpine soil beneath them a vibrant, living crimson. They did not scream. They did not collapse in a struggle. They simply ceased to exist and fell to the ground like withered corpses. The meadows of Shadow Ridge seemed hungry, avidly absorbing the liquid until the ground appeared as if it had never received a single drop. Then, their lifeless remains were lifted into the air by an invisible and powerful current, sucked toward a narrow, dark fissure within the rocky face of a nearby cliff. They were engulfed by the mountain like dust in a vacuum, vanishing into the cold, jagged depths of the rock from which no prey ever returns. The silence that followed was crushing and suffocating. I remained motionless, a petrified witness to a cycle of death that has haunted this range long before our arrival. This site is not a vacation destination. It is an altar demanding a rhythmic and constant tribute of human lives. Shadow Ridge is a harvesting machine, a calculated location where the barrier between our world and the realm of the jinn is kept deliberately thin. My role as an accountant is now moot, for I finally discern the patterns of how shadows cluster in the timberline and how the air cools near the jagged peaks. Each campsite is a marker for the graves of those who were chosen to feed the insatiable void. My end is approaching. I feel the weight of their gaze upon my back as I look toward the summit. I have abandoned all hope of escape, for I understand that the mountains have marked me as their next receptacle. I dissolve into the legacy of Shadow Ridge, a spark of consciousness destined to be erased by the same forces I had sworn to ignore. The earth will claim my remains, and the cycle of the wilderness will endure, while only my forgotten hiking gear will remain to testify that I breathed and feared these invisible eyes that have now closed upon their final acquisition. The darkness waiting for its sustenance beneath these ancient strata has completed its claim upon me, and I realize that my existence in this blood-soaked retreat is merely a tiny event in an infinite chain of victims that will never find a resolution. For the very mountains breathe, starve, and avidly consume every fleeting moment of our fragile summer lives to satisfy their hunger for our final inevitable deletion. The wheelchair that moved at midnight. When Hollow Creek Rehabilitation Center closed its doors, most of the equipment was sold or discarded. Only one wheelchair remained behind. It stood alone in the longest hallway, its metal frame polished, its wheels perfectly clean, despite years of dust covering everything else. The locals avoided the abandoned building. They whispered that the wheelchair belonged to a young patient named Ethan, a cheerful boy who loved exploring every corner of the center. One winter night, he vanished without a trace. No one ever discovered what had happened, yet every security guard who worked there claimed they heard the sound of slow rolling wheels after midnight. Emma, a 24-year-old documentary filmmaker, had spent years investigating abandoned places. Ghost stories never frightened her. She believed every mystery had a logical explanation. When she heard about the forgotten rehabilitation center, she packed her camera, a flashlight, and an audio recorder before driving there, just before sunset. The building was colder than the evening air outside. Empty patient rooms stretched along endless corridors, their walls covered with faded paint. Every sound echoed unnaturally, even the smallest footstep. At the end of the main hallway stood the wheelchair. Its footrests were unfolded. Its brakes were unlocked, as though someone had just stepped away from it. Emma slowly approached and filmed every detail. There were no footprints in the dust except her own. She reached out and gently touched one of the handles. It was warm. She pulled her hand back immediately. A loud metallic click echoed through the hallway. The wheelchair rolled forward by itself, only a few centimeters. Then it stopped. Emma stared at it, convinced the floor must be uneven. She checked. The hallway was perfectly level. Trying to stay calm, she continued recording. Midnight arrived. Without warning, every emergency light in the corridor flickered at once. Her audio recorder crackled with heavy static. Then a child's voice whispered, "Please, don't let it stop." Emma froze. The wheelchair began moving again. This time it rolled slowly down the hallway. Its wheels turned without making a single sound. Unable to resist her curiosity, she followed. The chair stopped outside a locked therapy room. Its door had been sealed with rusted chains decades earlier. The handle shook gently. Then the chains fell to the floor, as if someone had quietly unlocked them from the inside. The room beyond was empty except for dozens of faded drawings covering the walls. Every picture showed the same hallway, the same wheelchair, and a tall shadow standing behind it. Emma raised her flashlight. The beam suddenly dimmed. Behind her came the unmistakable sound of rubber wheels turning, very slowly, very close. She spun around. The wheelchair was only a meter away. No one was pushing it. Its empty seat faced her like an invitation. Another whisper filled the room. Someone has to ride. The flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Emma heard breathing, not her own. Something circled the room with deliberate, patient movements. The wheels rolled again. Closer. Closer. When her flashlight finally flickered back to life, the wheelchair stood exactly where she had first found it. The room was silent. Shaken, Emma hurried outside before dawn. She never released the documentary. Back home, she reviewed her footage frame by frame. The camera had captured something she had never seen inside the building. Every time the wheelchair moved, a transparent boy was sitting in it. He never looked at the camera. He was staring past Emma, at someone standing directly behind her. The final seconds of the recording contained no image, only sound. Two voices. The first belonged to the frightened child. "Thank you for staying with me." The second was much deeper, cold, patient. "You took my place." The video ended there. Months later, the rehabilitation center was demolished. Workers reported that every piece of furniture was removed except one object: the wheelchair. It could not be lifted. It could not be broken. When the last wall collapsed, it was still standing untouched in the middle of the ruins. Travelers passing the empty lot sometimes stop after midnight, certain they hear slow wheels rolling across the cracked concrete. They never see anyone, only a lonely wheelchair waiting beneath the moonlight, with its brakes unlocked, as if expecting its next passenger. The Phantom Transit on Route 66. My name is Silas, and I am a long-haul truck driver who has spent decades traversing the endless, desolate stretches of the American Southwest. Based in a small depot near Kingman, Arizona, I have seen countless strange occurrences on these lonely roads. But nothing could have prepared me for the incident that occurred near the ghost town of Oatman. For years, I dismissed the stories of hitchhikers who vanish from cab seats as drunken campfire myths. I was profoundly wrong. I have recently discovered that this stretch of highway is not a simple thoroughfare, but a structural harvest field for jinns, primordial and formless entities that have claimed the roadside as their personal hunting ground. They do not hunt through physical force, as they have no need to touch anyone. They simply project their will upon a target, and the human life essence is instantly extracted, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, desiccated husk. Last Tuesday, while driving through a particularly barren patch of the desert, I saw a lone figure standing by the shoulder with a thumb extended. Driven by a misplaced sense of duty, I pulled over. A man climbed into the passenger seat, his clothes appearing decades out of date, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. As we drove, the air inside the cab became unnaturally heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and metallic decay. I glanced over, and my breath hitched. The stranger had not spoken, but I could feel his gaze, an ancient, predatory focus projected entirely onto me. Suddenly, he reached toward a small, ornate compass he carried, and the reality within the truck shifted. In a single synchronized heartbeat, the stranger's influence reached out to a second vehicle I had been following, a family car that had recently pulled alongside me. The occupants of the car, through no physical interaction from the hitchhiker, froze simultaneously. I watched in horror as their bodies petrified while moving at high speed. Their expressions shifted from the mundanity of a family trip to a state of total abyssal abandonment. Without warning, a stream of dark, deep blood, under immense pressure, erupted from their eyes, ears, and mouths. It was an ejection of brutal efficiency, instantly painting the interior of their vehicle in a vibrant, living crimson. They did not scream. They did not swerve. Their car simply drifted off the road, carrying their withered remains into the desert brush. Then their lifeless forms were lifted into the air by an invisible and powerful current, sucked toward a narrow, dark rift that opened in the air above the highway. They were engulfed by the void like dust in a vacuum, vanishing into the cold, jagged depths of a dimension from which no prey ever returns. The silence that followed was crushing. I remained motionless, a petrified witness to a cycle of death that has haunted this route since the asphalt was first poured. This road is not a transit system. It is an altar demanding a rhythmic and constant tribute of human lives. The highway is a harvesting machine, a calculated location where the barrier between our world and the realm of the jinn is kept deliberately thin. My role as a driver is now moot, for I finally discern the patterns of how shadows cluster and how the air cools near the asphalt. Every mile marker is a monument for the graves of those who were chosen to feed the insatiable void. My end is approaching. I feel the weight of the hitchhiker's gaze upon my neck as the desert night closes in. I have abandoned all hope of escape, for I understand that the road has marked me as its next receptacle. I dissolve into the legacy of the desert, a spark of consciousness destined to be erased by the same forces I had sworn to avoid. The sand will claim my remains, and the cycle of the highway will endure, while only the cooling engine will remain to testify that I breathed and feared these invisible eyes that have now closed upon their final acquisition. The darkness waiting for its sustenance beneath the desert floor has completed its claim upon me, and I realize that my existence on this blood-soaked road is merely a tiny event in an infinite chain of victims that will never find a resolution. For the terrain itself hungers and avidly consumes every fleeting moment of our fragile lives to sate its appetite for our final, inevitable departure. Ardell, the last night bus. On a cold autumn evening, Ethan stood alone at a nearly forgotten bus station on the edge of northern England. Rain tapped softly against the cracked shelter while the departure board flickered with missing letters. Only one destination remained readable: Raven's Hollow. It was a small town hidden between forests, 4 hours away. The last intercity bus was already waiting with its engine humming quietly. The driver never looked at Ethan as he climbed aboard. He simply pointed toward the empty seats. There were only 6 passengers scattered throughout the bus. An elderly woman stared through the window without blinking. A young man slept with his hood covering his face. Near the back sat a little girl holding an old teddy bear, whispering to it as if expecting an answer. The doors closed with a heavy hiss, and the journey began. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Rain covered the windows, hiding the empty countryside. The passengers remained perfectly silent. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Every road sign they passed displayed the same distance: Raven's Hollow, 47 miles. No matter how long they drove, the number never changed. He checked his phone. There was no signal. Even stranger, the time refused to move. It remained exactly 11:47 p.m. Trying to distract himself, Ethan walked toward the driver. "Excuse me, are we taking a detour?" The driver did not answer. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed toward the windshield. Outside, the road had disappeared into a thick white fog. Nothing else existed. No trees, no lights, no stars. Only the endless road stretching into darkness. Uneasy, Ethan returned to his seat. As he sat down, he realized another passenger had appeared. A tall man wearing a long black coat now occupied the seat across the aisle. Ethan was certain that seat had been empty moments earlier. The stranger smiled politely. "I don't think we've met before," he whispered. His voice sounded distant, like an old recording. Before Ethan could respond, every light inside the bus went out. For several seconds, only the engine could be heard. When the lights returned, the elderly woman was gone. Her seat was empty. No one reacted. The bus continued forward. Minutes later, the sleeping young man disappeared as well. Then another passenger, and another. Each time the lights flickered, one seat became vacant. No footsteps, no opening doors. Only silence. Soon, Ethan and the little girl were the only passengers left. She looked at him with sad eyes. "You shouldn't have boarded," she said softly. "My stop was many years ago." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, she faded away like mist touched by sunlight. Now he was alone. The driver finally spoke. "Last passenger." The bus slowed beside an abandoned roadside station surrounded by darkness. There was no building, no town, only a single bench beneath a broken street lamp. The doors opened. "You must get off," the driver said. "I don't live here," Ethan replied. The driver's expression never changed. "No one does." A freezing wind entered the bus. Ethan stepped outside without understanding why. The doors closed immediately. The bus drove away into the fog without leaving tire tracks. Within seconds, its lights vanished completely. Morning sunlight eventually broke through the clouds. A passing truck driver found Ethan sitting alone beside an old concrete platform covered in weeds. "There hasn't been a bus stop here for over 30 years, the driver said. Confused, Ethan searched for proof of the night's journey. His ticket was still in his pocket. The ink had faded, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. "Thank you for traveling with the last night bus. Your return trip is already scheduled." Since that night, every year on the same date at exactly 11:47 p.m., Ethan hears heavy brakes stopping outside his home. When he dares to look through the window, the street is always empty, except for a single bus ticket resting on his doorstep. The Unseen Toll of Whispering Pines. My name is Gregory, and I am a structural engineer tasked with evaluating the safety of a popular attraction known as the Manor in rural Kentucky, a site marketed as the state's most intense haunted house experience. For years, I dismissed the local stories about guests who never left the attraction as exaggerated marketing ploys meant to drive up ticket sales. I was profoundly wrong. I have recently discovered that this attraction is not a mere stage set for entertainment, but a structural harvest field for jinns, primordial and formless entities that have claimed these creaking corridors as their personal hunting ground. They do not hunt through physical force, as they have no need to touch anyone. They simply project their will upon a target, and the human life essence is instantly extracted, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, desiccated husk. Last Saturday, while conducting a stress test on the floorboards of the attic section of the house, I witnessed their harvesting process. Two teenagers, who had paid for a VIP private tour, entered the final room of the maze. I watched them through the attraction's hidden observation deck, and my breath hitched when the air around them became unnaturally heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and metallic decay. Without any physical interaction, without a single hand reaching toward them, their bodies petrified simultaneously. Their expressions shifted from the adrenaline-fueled thrill of the jump scares to a state of total, abyssal abandonment. In a single synchronized heartbeat, a stream of dark, deep blood under immense pressure erupted from their eyes, ears, and mouths. It was an ejection of brutal efficiency, instantly staining the dusty, props-filled floor beneath them a vibrant, living crimson. They did not scream. They did not collapse in a struggle. They simply ceased to exist and fell to the ground like withered corpses. The walls of the manor seemed hungry, avidly absorbing the liquid until the weathered wood appeared as if it had never received a single drop. Then, their lifeless remains were lifted into the air by an invisible and powerful current, sucked toward a narrow, dark fissure within the painted Victorian paneling. They were engulfed by the structure like dust in a vacuum, vanishing into the cold, jagged depths of the earth, from which no prey ever returns. The silence that followed was crushing and suffocating. I remained motionless, a petrified witness to a cycle of death that has haunted this property long before our arrival. This site is not a haunted house. It is an altar demanding a rhythmic and constant tribute of human lives. The manor is a harvesting machine, a calculated location where the barrier between our world and the realm of the jinn is kept deliberately thin. My role as an engineer is now moot, for I finally discern the patterns of how shadows cluster in the fake spider webs and how the air cools near the hidden doorways. Each room is a marker for the graves of those who were chosen to feed the insatiable void. My end is approaching. I feel the weight of their gaze upon my back as I stand in the observation booth. I have abandoned all hope of escape, for I understand that the house has marked me as its next receptacle. I dissolve into the legacy of the manor, a spark of consciousness destined to be erased by the same forces I had sworn to analyze. The ground will claim my remains, and the cycle of the attraction will endure, while only the rotting timber will remain to testify that I breathed and feared these invisible eyes that have now closed upon their final acquisition. The darkness waiting for its sustenance beneath these hollowed-out foundations has completed its claim upon me. And I realize that my existence in this blood-soaked structure is merely a tiny event in an infinite chain of victims that will never find a resolution, for the very architecture breathes, starves, and avidly consumes every fleeting moment of our fragile lives to satisfy its hunger for our final, absolute cessation of being. The last broadcast of Black Hollow. In the autumn of 1957, deep in the Appalachian Hills, stood the isolated village of Black Hollow. Only a handful of families remained, living quiet lives surrounded by dense forests and winding dirt roads. Electricity had arrived only a few years earlier, but every home still kept an old battery-powered radio close at hand. It was the only reliable connection to the outside world. 26-year-old Thomas Carter worked as the village's radio repairman. Calm, practical, and fascinated by electronics, he was known for fixing anything that produced sound. While most villagers believed in old ghost stories, Thomas trusted wires, tubes, and logic. One rainy evening, an elderly farmer rushed into his workshop carrying a silent radio. "It keeps talking after I turn it off," the old man whispered. Thomas smiled politely. He assumed a faulty capacitor or loose wiring was to blame. That night, after repairing the set, he placed it on his workbench. At exactly 11 minutes past midnight, the radio clicked by itself. A faint crackle filled the room. Then came a voice, slow, weak, almost buried beneath static. "Do not answer the knocking." Thomas immediately checked the switches. The radio was unplugged. Its power cord lay coiled on the floor. The voice vanished. He convinced himself it had been his imagination. The following evening, another villager arrived with the same complaint. Then another. Every radio in Black Hollow had begun speaking after midnight. Always unplugged. Always with the same warning. The local sheriff dismissed the stories as mass hysteria, but Thomas could not ignore the strange pattern. He decided to stay awake in his workshop with 3 repaired radios placed side by side. Midnight arrived. Nothing happened. Then, at 11 minutes past, all 3 radios switched on together. Static roared through the room. This time, the voice sounded clearer. "If someone knocks, never open the door." The lights flickered. 3 slow knocks echoed from the front entrance. Thomas froze. He knew no one should be outside. Heavy rain poured across the village, and the muddy road was deserted. The knocking came again. 3 slow taps, perfectly even. He approached the window and pulled the curtain aside. No one stood on the porch, only darkness and falling rain. Then another knock came, not from the door, from inside the workshop, behind him. He spun around. Nothing had moved. Yet every radio was now broadcasting the same low humming sound. The next morning, Thomas questioned the oldest resident of Black Hollow. The old woman listened without surprise. "I heard those voices when I was a little girl," she said. Back then, people who answered the midnight knocking simply disappeared. Their homes were found empty, but their radios kept playing for days. Thomas searched old newspapers in the county archive. Hidden among faded pages, he found a forgotten article from 1929. Several families had vanished during a violent storm. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Only abandoned homes with radios still producing unexplained static. Determined to uncover the truth, Thomas returned to his workshop on the next stormy night. Again, the warning came. Again, 3 knocks sounded at the door. This time, he did not move. The knocking continued for several minutes before stopping completely. Silence settled over the building. Relieved, Thomas believed the nightmare was finally over. Then the largest radio on his bench came alive one last time. There was no static, only a clear recording. It was his own voice. I opened the door. Thomas stared in disbelief. He had never spoken those words. A cold breeze drifted through the room. The front door was still locked, but behind him came the unmistakable sound of slow footsteps crossing the wooden floor. One, then another. He refused to turn around. The footsteps stopped only inches away. The next morning, the sheriff found the workshop empty. Thomas Carter had vanished without leaving a single footprint in the mud outside. His tools remained neatly arranged. His coffee was still warm, and every radio in the room repeated the same sentence over and over. He answered, "Eventually." To this day, antique radio collectors tell an unsettling story. They say that if an old 1950s radio begins playing static at exactly 11 minutes past midnight, you should never listen for too long, because beneath the crackling noise, someone may already be whispering your name, waiting for you to answer. The whisper beneath the Great Pyramid. No one in Egypt could explain why the oldest tunnel beneath the Great Pyramid had remained sealed for centuries. Archaeologists believed it was unfinished, while local guides quietly insisted that the passage had been closed on purpose. They all agreed on one thing: no expedition had ever explored its deepest chamber. Daniel Carter, a 30-year-old British archaeologist, had spent years studying ancient Egyptian relics. When his team uncovered a hidden limestone doorway beneath the pyramid, he felt he was standing on the edge of the greatest discovery of his career. The doorway bore no hieroglyphs, only a single carved eye. It seemed to watch everyone who approached. The entrance was opened just before sunset. A narrow staircase disappeared into complete darkness. The air below was strangely cold, carrying a faint whisper that no microphone could record. Daniel laughed it off. It must be the wind. Yet there was no wind beneath hundreds of feet of stone. As the team descended, their flashlights revealed walls polished smoother than any known Egyptian corridor. Oddly, there was no dust. It looked as though someone had walked there only moments before. Hours later, they reached a circular chamber, unlike anything ever discovered. At its center rested a black stone coffin. No name, no decorations, no symbols, only another carved eye. When Daniel touched the lid, every flashlight flickered. For a brief second, total darkness surrounded them. Then came the whisper, "You should not have opened it." Everyone froze. The translators insisted the words had been spoken in perfect English. The Egyptian workers heard them in Arabic. Each person believed the voice had used their own language. Slowly, the coffin lid slid aside without anyone touching it. Inside, there was no mummy, only an ancient bronze mirror. Its surface reflected the room perfectly, except for one detail. The reflection showed an extra person standing behind the team. Tall, wrapped in dark linen, its face hidden beneath a hood. Daniel spun around. Nothing. The chamber was empty. When he looked back into the mirror, the figure had moved closer. No one else seemed to notice. Ignoring the growing fear in his chest, Daniel lifted the mirror. The whisper immediately became louder. Not one voice. Hundreds. Some cried, some prayed. Some simply repeated the same sentence. "Close the gate." The temperature dropped so quickly that their breath became visible. Then the walls began to tremble. Tiny grains of sand drifted from the ceiling. One of the workers shouted that the exit tunnel was collapsing. The team rushed toward the staircase. Daniel was the last to leave. As he reached the doorway, he glanced once more at the mirror. The hooded figure was no longer inside it. Instead, the reflection showed Daniel completely alone. No team, no chamber, only endless darkness stretching behind him. A cold hand touched his shoulder. He turned instantly. There was no one, but fresh footprints appeared in the sand ahead of him. Bare feet, walking upward, walking toward the surface. The expedition escaped moments before the hidden entrance collapsed forever beneath falling stone. Official reports described the mission as a geological failure. The chamber was declared inaccessible. No mention was ever made of the mirror. Daniel returned to France carrying only his notebook. For weeks, he barely slept. Every night he dreamed of the underground chamber. Every night the whisper grew clearer. "Return what you took." He insisted he had taken nothing. Months later, while reviewing the expedition photographs, he noticed something impossible. In every picture taken inside the chamber, the hooded figure stood somewhere in the background. Sometimes near the wall, sometimes beside the coffin, always watching. The photographer swore the figure had never been there. Daniel deleted every image. The next morning, they had all returned. One rainy evening, he opened his notebook to continue writing his report. A sentence had appeared across the final page. It was written in ancient Egyptian symbols. Beneath them was a perfect English translation. "The mirror was never the relic. You were." At that moment, every light in his apartment went out. Silence filled the room. Then came the sound of slow footsteps crossing the wooden floor. 1, 2, 3. Daniel held his breath. The darkness remained still until two ancient eyes quietly opened in front of him, glowing like polished gold. They had been waiting beneath the pyramid for thousands of years. Now they had finally found their way home. The Hollow Harvest of Oak Haven. My name is Nathaniel, and I am a heritage investigator tasked with documenting the structural decay of Oak Haven, a long-abandoned settlement tucked away in the deep thickets of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. For years, I dismissed the local legends about the unseen reapers of Oak Haven as mere campfire stories designed to deter looters and curiosity seekers. I was profoundly wrong. I have recently discovered that this village is not a simple abandoned site, but a structural harvest field for jinns, primordial and formless entities that have claimed this valley as their personal hunting ground. They do not hunt through physical force, as they have no need to touch anyone. They simply project their will upon a target, and the human life essence is instantly extracted, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, desiccated husk. Last Friday, while inspecting the foundations of the old communal forge, I witnessed their harvesting process. Two of my team members, who had wandered away from the main perimeter to examine an anomalous stone structure, froze suddenly in the middle of the overgrown village square. I watched them through my binoculars from the safety of the perimeter fence, and my breath hitched when the air around them became unnaturally heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and metallic decay. Without any physical interaction, without a single hand reaching toward them, their bodies petrified simultaneously. Their expressions shifted from technical focus to a state of total, abyssal abandonment. In a single synchronized heartbeat, a stream of dark, deep blood under immense pressure erupted from their eyes, ears, and mouths. It was an ejection of brutal efficiency, instantly staining the dry, compacted earth beneath them a vibrant, living crimson. They did not scream. They did not collapse in a struggle. They simply ceased to exist and fell to the ground like withered corpses. The soil of Oak Haven seemed hungry, avidly absorbing the liquid until the ground appeared as if it had never received a single drop. Then, their lifeless remains were lifted into the air by an invisible and powerful current, sucked toward a narrow, dark fissure within the decaying wall of the community hall. They were engulfed by the structure like dust in a vacuum, vanishing into the cold, jagged depths of the earth from which no prey ever returns. The silence that followed was crushing and suffocating. I remained motionless, a petrified witness to a cycle of death that has haunted this cursed place long before our arrival. This site is not a village. It is an altar demanding a rhythmic and constant tribute of human lives. Oak Haven is a harvesting machine, a calculated location where the barrier between our world and the realm of the jinn is kept deliberately thin. My role as an investigator is now moot, for I finally discern the patterns of how shadows cluster and how the air cools near the rotted timbers. Each cabin is a marker for the graves of those who were chosen to feed the insatiable void. My end is approaching. I feel the weight of their gaze upon my back as the sky darkens. I have abandoned all hope of escape, for I understand that the village has marked me as its next receptacle. I dissolve into the legacy of Oak Haven, a spark of consciousness destined to be erased by the same forces I had sworn to unveil. The earth will claim my remains, and the cycle of the settlement will endure, while only the cold, weathered stone will remain to testify that we breathed and feared these invisible eyes that have now closed upon their final acquisition. The darkness waiting for its sustenance beneath these ancestral foundations has completed its claim upon me, and I realize that my existence in this blood-soaked site is merely a tiny event in an infinite chain of victims that will never find a resolution, for the foundations themselves wake, starve, and avidly consume every fleeting moment of our fragile lives to sate their hunger for our finality. The gun that never missed. People in the quiet French village of Valcroix never spoke about the abandoned watchtower on Black Hill after sunset. According to an old legend, a single revolver had remained hidden inside the tower for more than 100 years. It was said that the weapon never missed its target, not because of perfect aim, but because it always chose its own victim. Ethan, a young photographer fascinated by forgotten places, arrived in the village hoping to document local legends. The villagers welcomed him politely, but their expressions changed the moment he mentioned the tower. An elderly man quietly warned him, "If you find an old revolver with a silver grip, do not touch it. Some things are meant to stay asleep." Curiosity proved stronger than a caution. Late one rainy evening, Ethan climbed the winding path leading to the tower. Thick fog surrounded the ruins, swallowing every sound except the distant rumble of thunder. The heavy wooden door stood slightly open, as though someone had entered only moments before. Inside, dust covered the cracked stone floor. Broken furniture lay scattered beneath collapsed beams, yet the air felt strangely warm. Then he heard it. Click, a metallic sound echoed somewhere above him. He climbed the spiral staircase. Click, another sound, this time closer. The top room was empty except for a small wooden table standing beneath a shattered window. Resting on the table was an old revolver with a polished silver grip. Although everything else was buried beneath years of dust, the gun looked perfectly clean. Beside it lay a faded note. "It fires only when fear tells it where to aim." Ethan laughed nervously. He convinced himself that someone had left the revolver there as part of an elaborate prank. Without thinking, he picked it up. The metal was ice cold. At that exact moment, every window slammed shut. Darkness swallowed the room. The revolver's cylinder began turning on its own. Slowly, one chamber after another. Click, click, click. Ethan dropped the weapon, but it did not hit the floor. Instead, it remained suspended in the air. A whisper drifted through the darkness. "Who are you hiding from?" The room suddenly filled with shadows stretching across the walls like living smoke. None of them had faces, yet all seemed to be staring directly at him. The revolver rotated until its barrel pointed toward the doorway. No one stood there. Another whisper. "He's coming." Footsteps echoed from the staircase below. Slow, steady, impossible. Ethan held his breath. The footsteps continued climbing, but no figure appeared. Only the sound. Step, step, step. The invisible presence reached the top of the stairs. The revolver fired. The deafening shot echoed through the tower. There was no flash, no bullet hole, only silence. Then the footsteps stopped forever. The windows burst open. The fog rushed inside before disappearing just as quickly. Shaken, Ethan fled the tower without looking back. The next morning, he examined the photographs stored on his camera. Every picture looked normal until the final one. It showed Ethan standing beside the table. Across from him stood a tall man wearing a faded military coat from another century. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a cracked hat. One empty holster hung from his belt. His right hand pointed directly toward Ethan. Behind the mysterious figure, dozens of transparent silhouettes filled the room, each with a dark hole over the heart, all staring silently into the camera. Ethan deleted the photograph. A second later, it returned. He destroyed the memory card. The image appeared on his laptop. He threw the camera into a river. That night, he woke to a familiar metallic sound. Click. On the chair beside his bed rested the same silver-handled revolver. Its cylinder slowly turned by itself. One chamber stopped in front of the barrel. A single whisper rose from the darkness. "Your turn to guard it." Ever since that night, travelers passing Black Hill sometimes report hearing only one sound drifting from the abandoned tower after midnight. A lone revolver being carefully loaded by someone who can no longer be seen. The last passenger to Cappadocia. When Ethan boarded the overnight bus from Istanbul to Cappadocia, he expected nothing more than a long journey across Turkey. The roads stretched through mountains, silent villages, and endless plains beneath a sky filled with stars. Most passengers fell asleep within an hour, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of the wind outside. Around midnight, Ethan noticed something strange. Every time the bus stopped, people got off and new passengers climbed aboard. Yet one elderly woman, dressed in an old-fashioned black coat, never moved. She sat in the last row, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. Whenever Ethan glanced toward her, he felt as though she was already looking at him. Unable to sleep, he asked the driver during a short break, "Who is the woman in the back?" The driver frowned. "What woman?" Ethan pointed toward the last seat. The driver looked through the bus. "There is nobody there." Confused, Ethan returned to his seat. The old woman had not moved. She slowly raised one gloved hand and pointed towards the window. Outside, in the middle of the empty countryside, dozens of shadowy figures stood perfectly still beside the road. None of them had faces. The bus drove past them without slowing down. As the night grew darker, strange things began to happen. Passengers started whispering in their sleep, all speaking the same sentence in different voices. "Don't miss your stop. The lights flickered. The digital clock above the driver froze at 2:17. No matter how long Ethan watched it, the time never changed. Then the bus entered a dense fog. Everything outside disappeared. Even the headlights seemed unable to pierce the white mist. Without warning, the engine fell silent. Yet the bus continued moving. No one else appeared to notice. The sleeping passengers remained perfectly still. Only the old woman stood up. She slowly walked down the aisle. Her footsteps made no sound. When she reached Ethan, she handed him a worn paper ticket. It was yellow with age. Printed on it were only 4 words. Last journey, 1 passenger. Before Ethan could speak, she disappeared. Not walked away. Simply disappeared. Moments later, the fog cleared. The bus had stopped beside a lonely stone bridge stretching over a deep valley. No buildings, no lights, no signs, only silence. The doors opened by themselves. Several sleeping passengers stood up at exactly the same moment. Without opening their eyes, they calmly stepped off the bus and crossed the bridge. None of them returned. The driver remained frozen behind the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if trapped in time. Ethan wanted to follow the others, but an old shepherd suddenly appeared beside the road. "Stay where you are," he said quietly. "That bridge is not for the living." The bus doors slammed shut. The engine roared back to life. Within seconds, the bridge, the valley, and the mysterious passengers had vanished. Only an empty highway remained. At sunrise, the bus finally reached Cappadocia. The passengers stretched, smiled, and collected their bags as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan searched for the old woman. Her seat was empty. The driver insisted that every seat had been occupied except the last one. "There was never anyone back there," he repeated. Trying to forget the night, Ethan checked into a small hotel. While unpacking, he discovered the old paper ticket inside his backpack. He was certain he had never put it there. On the back, a new sentence had appeared in faded ink. "Your stop was postponed, not cancelled." That evening, as hundreds of hot air balloons floated peacefully above the valleys of Cappadocia, Ethan raised his camera to capture the view. In every photograph, the colorful balloons filled the sky, but in the corner of each image, standing alone on a distant cliff, was the same old woman in the black coat. She was no longer pointing at the road. She was pointing directly at him.